Welkom! Leuk dat je kijkt of luistert naar Via Live, de podcast van Via Nederland, waar we vanuit onze events verslag doen. We zitten vandaag bij de Privacy-Centric AdTech Summit bij DPG Media in Amsterdam. En we gaan het hebben over het raakvlak van adverteren, data, privacy en regelgeving. Mijn naam is Boj Holslag en vandaag ben ik in gesprek met Daphne van Doorn, Head of EU Affairs bij der Bundesverband Digitale Wirtschaft, Sebastian Grantz, Global AI en Privacy Lead Industry Relations bij Google en Stefan Havik hier bij DPG Media, de Chief Digital Officer. Gezien de internationale setting gaan we verder in het Engels. En we beginnen even met een openingsvraag voor jou, Daphne. In your keynote today, you highlighted the complexity of the European privacy landscape for digital media. What are the most important strategic actions businesses should take? Or what are the most important actions that the industry as a whole or regulators should take?
Well, that's a very broad question to start with. Thank you very much for inviting me. In my keynote today, I focused very much on the evolving privacy landscape. And in my role, I'm head of EU affairs, so I work very much with the Brussels landscape, meaning I look at legislation, what's coming from Brussels, and the impact that that's going to have on our sector, and in general, what is going to be the impact also for business models in the future. And basically, to answer your question, what's the most important thing businesses should focus on? One of the things I mentioned today is that I think businesses need to be prepared for complexity. Many of them already are. The focus today is very much on privacy-centric AdTech, which I think is, in general, the future, what we're focusing on. Privacy needs to be centric and needs to be at the forefront. But I see particularly companies that are doing well are the ones who are a bit more flexible and can adapt also their business models to the ongoing privacy legislative landscape. As a business as a whole, I think, as I already mentioned, privacy-centric I think is a very good focus. And I do think that we need to also ask, as a business, as a sector, as a whole, coming together, all of us, we need to also be more forceful in Brussels and need to also mention the impact some of the legislative changes are going to have on the entire ecosystem. And then we're not only talking about the big ones, but we're actually talking about the entire ecosystem that is behind. Policymakers don't understand how privacy actually works in practice. And that actually needs to change. So if we can do that together, then I think we are on the right way.
When I hear together, we are with a lot of advertisers and publishers and the tech giants like Google in this industry. Starting with DPG Media, Stefan. Obviously, you are a very large publisher. Mm-hmm. Do you sometimes or often see that you are really taking the leading role, and do you see that you set the standard, and do you also have some examples where you have been setting the standard in how you work with data and how you perceive privacy?
Tough question. So are people looking at us to set a standard? I'm not sure. That's probably for others to answer. We try to. So I think it's our obligation to lead the market where we can. I think we have the resource to make proper investments in tech and data and privacy. So we try to play our part. Like a few examples I also touched on in the session today. One is called DATA, the Digital Ethical Data and AI Assistant. What's a mouthful? Which we developed with the University of Utrecht to help the market in making ethical decisions when it comes to data and AI usage. So that's a thing we've developed with the university and are making available to the market end of May for free. So that's one example. A thing we tried to do. It's not a thing we initiated, but I think we were the first publishing company in Europe to look at GARM, In the meantime, it's been torpedoed by a person in the US, and it died a graceful death. But we still use it as a methodology to make sure we can guarantee to advertisers their brands are safe in the context we provide. So there's a few examples, but we didn't really started those from let's start to lead the market, but we started from our own sort of challenges. So that was the starting point, and I think the size we have obligates us to look at a wider market perspective.
We will talk about a couple of those solutions in a minute. Sebastian, from Google's perspective, there have been great ideas offered in the privacy sandbox for the last years. The world is changing continuously, so not everything sticks around, of course. What are your biggest learnings from these last years? And can you recap for the viewer or the listener what is being developed right now and what you really believe in to be the next solution to simplify privacy and to make it better for everybody?
It was a very ambitious initiative. We knew that, and we tried to make it work. We thought we could change the industry together for the better, but it turned out it was really hard to pull it off, because even after we spent a lot of energy and time into this initiative, we still got a lot of kind of what you call divergent feedback, and we realized it was like some liked it, some didn't like it, and that's fair. But even after all the changes we made, we felt like the best approach would be to keep the status quo. So with that, kind of the privacy sandbox or the APIs have been deprecated now. One thing kind of that remains is our investment in general into privacy enhancing technologies. So technologies that have privacy at its core, that improve user privacy, that makes it harder to re-identify users by having this built-in privacy features. And we strongly believe that this is the right approach going forward, not only on the browser level, but also in all AdTech digital products. And we really hope that these technologies will see greater adoption, not only by big tech companies, but also by the wider industry.
Daphne, what makes it so difficult for businesses in Europe to adopt these changes?
Well, there's different aspects, I think. And then we're also talking about which changes are we talking about that businesses need to make. The ecosystem as a whole is very diverse. We see this. So basically, I work for a membership organization, and all of our members are very differently in size. So we have some of the big players. Sebastian and I already know each other quite well. But we also have a lot of the smaller players. We have some smaller platforms. We have advertisers, publishers, everything in between, vendors. We also actually have a lot of digital and creative agencies. We're actually the biggest agency association, if you will. And of course, the representation that we then have, we also see that internally when we try to come up with new standards, it takes a lot of discussion. There's a lot of uncertainty in where do we want to go forward, what do we want to change, where do we want to also put our focus. And I do think that there is a certain extent of legal and regulatory uncertainty at the moment. We see this with the coming changes. We talked today also earlier on about the digital omnibus, for example. And there has been, especially within the digital landscape, there has been a lot of involvement when it comes down to legislation. We all know that the GDPR was the first, basically, if you will. It set the baseline. But on top of that, we now have the DMA, we have the DSA, we have the AI Act, we have the Data Act, we have everything that is still ongoing also in its implementation. And that in and of itself creates uncertainty, because which legislation is the one to follow, which is basically on top, which is in which instances do I need to follow which law. I think it's very, very complicated. And now that we're again in a phase where we're changing laws again, industry is not entirely sure where it's going to go. So the main point is make sure that you are prepared for uncertainty, that you are able to build your business models in a way that you can adapt quickly, which also means that some teams need to be more flexible in how they adapt. And I always say this when I talk a lot with legal and a lot with compliance. They very often like to tell us no, but we need to also ask them, okay, if the answer is no, then I can rephrase my question. What can we do so that the answer is actually yes?
Yeah. And I think if I can add, there's also the just brutal commercial reality. Yeah. So one of the things that came out of the Privacy Sandbox was, if I recall correctly, but you probably know it better than I do, is that Google Ad Manager CPMs dropped by 20%. Criteo dropped by 60%. So all these privacy initiatives we need to balance with the brutal commercial facts. And I think the thing we want to avoid always is to make sure we kill local media by over-regulating all the legislation you just mentioned, because it's very difficult to navigate.
In that complexity and that uncertainty, one of the safe havens in data might be contextual. Stefan, have you seen the rise of importance of contextual? Have you seen like an economic growth in that way of targeting for advertisers at DPG? And what is the importance for you?
So let me give you two perspectives. One is the perspective of contextual from an economic perspective. It doesn't work. So we've moved our most contextually relevant platform to contextual only. Advertising revenue minus 50%, 50.
Oh, wow.
And it was tweakers. And we did it on that platform because they have an active privacy-aware community. And it felt like that platform had the most contextual relevance. And advertisers were comfortable with being on board in that advertising tracking-free environment until they were faced with the downsides of measurement, the downsides of frequency management, i.e. the media wasn't effective enough anymore. So it's very difficult. So is it a commercial replacement for everything we do today? No. Is it sort of a thing we ignore? No, because we do have it as a broader offering in our advertising business. And also from a brand suitability perspective, it's very relevant. So in the world where content is sometimes a bit opaque, where you run your ads made for advertising websites, etc., contextual helps you find those spots in the online advertising space which are safe. So yeah, I'm afraid we're not there yet. We're definitely keen to make it bigger, but the advertiser demand is just not there yet.
Would that mean that you have a dependence on how marketers spend their budgets, be it more branding or be it more conversion? Would you dream or expect a shift in that perception from an advertiser perspective? Or do you think there's nothing that can change that?
I think the reality is that advertisers are concerned with these topics, but at the end of the day, they're accountable to report quarterly earnings. Mm-hmm. And that's how they decide where to invest. And if it doesn't move the needle, they don't invest it. So it's up to us as an industry to make sure contextual advertising performs as good as data-driven advertising. And if you're at that point, we'll be fine. If not, the money won't go there.
And any comments on that from your sides?
My comment would be here that is discussed quite a few times that contextual advertising doesn't offer the same revenue incentives like personalized advertising, and I think right now advertisers, they have a lot of choices. There are platforms that have bigger first-party data foundations that can offer maybe more data signals in a privacy-safe way and that are not as reliant on third-party data.
Yeah, that's us, by the way, just to make sure.
Yeah, but there are also, that's why we think that, for instance, if we invest into new technologies like privacy-enhancing technologies, there's always kind of probably a trade-off between privacy and, let's say, marketing utility. But if we can reduce this quite a bit so that this is kind of on par, and there's also incentive to use these technologies. And I'll give you one example. So, for instance, when we talk about privacy-enhancing technologies, many times it's seen as a compliance tool, but we think they can also offer some business opportunities. So, for instance, making it easier to share data with each other. So right now, advertisers are sometimes reluctant to share data with DPG Media or with Google or whoever, because this is very sensitive data, their most valuable data. But there are tools in place, for instance, something that is called a trusted execution environment, which allows companies to use it to give a technical guarantee to advertisers that their data cannot be shared with anyone, that it's only used for predetermined purposes. So there's a stronger incentive to share this data, and in order that, so then if advertisers can bring their own data, then they can make it more relevant on not only let's say on Google's platform, but also on DPG Media or on other media providers. So this could be one example how we can kind of make it also work in the future.
Stefan, in your session today, you showed the future of your data and privacy strategies here at DPG Media.
Mm-hmm.
Can you recap here what that is exactly?
So I think it's not too distant from what Sebastian just described. It's a focus on first-party data, not using any third-party identifier where we don't need to. That means also from a commercial perspective, building off the open market, which is a thing we hardly are reliant on anymore today. It's 3% of our revenue. It was 50% 6 years ago. So we've gradually built it down by developing our own sales channels, our own tech. And from a data perspective, we make sure we have privacy measures like if somebody transacts in the programmatic ecosystem, we rotate IDs in a way that they're not sort of useful anymore after a week. So they become garbage to whomever wants to steal it. So we do everything we can to still deliver on what an advertiser needs to move the needle, whilst making sure we focus on first party.
If I can jump in, this is exactly an example of where you can see that regulators don't understand. Because when you mention, that identifier is useless after a week, we're talking within the digital omnibus about the consent banners. We're talking about that we're not allowed to then show the same consent banner for a period of 6 months.
Yeah.
But basically your entire ecosystem is not built within a 6 month time frame. Nobody uses 6 months. So this is where I find this is a really good example of where this is actually just not practical in the way that legislators currently are thinking.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's even more important that those regulators incentivize the use of these technologies, because right now there's no incentive. You need consent for whatever technology you use, regardless if it uses minimal data or has mechanisms in place that protect data. That's why it's important that we get these incentives also from regulators, for instance, as part of the omnibus process.
Do these regulations currently make it harder for smaller parties? And do these regulations then increase or decrease fair competition in our market?
We see basically that with legislation, it's always having a bigger impact on smaller companies just because of the sheer volume of compliance that comes with it. So it's very much on how many people do I actually have and how many resources do I actually or can I actually allocate to the compliance part.
Yeah.
And as long as you need more, or especially with changing legislation, you need additional resources going to compliance that, for example, you can't use then for programming, which actually would make your products better, would actually, also make the user experience better. So we do see always that there is an impact on for the smaller companies. Doesn't mean that there is no impact for the big ones. Of course there is. But we see this within policy in general, that we're always being asked what is the impact for smaller companies, but we shouldn't only talk about the smaller companies. We should talk about the impact for the entire ecosystem, and that is, I think, something that is always under. There's not enough information or also focus on the impact of the entire ecosystem. And for some reason, we're not able, I'm really happy that we're having this discussion today, but for some reason, we're not able to explain how this ecosystem actually works.
it's already hard to explain within our ecosystem, within our market. So on the next birthday party, it's going to be even harder to explain this to friends and family.
Probably.
Stefan, thank you. We're going to change seats. We'll be right back. Stefan switched with Rob van Eyck. Rob, welcome. Rob, you are principal at Bureau Blauw.
Yes.
Do I say that correctly?
Yeah. It's Blauw from Willem Blauw, the old cartographer. Yes.
Oh, right. Okay. So for us Dutchies, that's really easy to pronounce. Mm-hmm. Let's start off the discussion right away with a question for you. Mm-hmm. Which case rulings stood out in the last few years that had a lot of impact on our industry? Mm-hmm. And how will this shape the future, in your opinion?
Well, there are actually a number of cases that deal with the question whether a unique identifier is personal data or not. And obviously the Breyer case is already a little bit older, but it's for legal students, it's mandatory reading. But ultimately, what we've seen play out over the last few years is the SRB case versus EDPS. And this basically, for those that are not super phrased in privacy, relates to the question whether personal data in the hands of one is also personal data in the hands of another. So it basically relates to the core question when we bring this to advertising technology. Is the cookie actually personal data? And if it is it personal data for everybody or just for some when you start sharing that cookie around in the online advertising ecosystem?
Would you consider this cookie, if I understand correctly, mm-hmm. Which technically lives within your browser as the consumer, mm-hmm. and where an advertiser or a publisher has your cookie ID in a database? Mm-hmm. At which point do you consider this to be personal data for the tech party, so the non-consumer part, and mm-hmm. at which point are we entering the gray area with that?
Yeah, well, just for the audience to help them understand, the cookie on your computer is just a small piece of text. You can actually read it, and the text contains a unique number. And then the question is, what's the function of that cookie? Well, if you visit a website, like a news website, the cookie that is already in your computer, in your browser, will be automatically sent to the website that you're visiting. And this enables them to recognize whether you've been there before or not. So you mentioned the database on the server side. So the main function is to be able to recognize someone. But that doesn't necessarily mean you know who it is. You just know that this is a unique identifier, a little bit of text that was present on a phone or on a laptop. That doesn't necessarily mean that you know that it was me. And this is relevant if you would ask a judge in court, because you need to establish that identity of the natural person, of a real human. And so, to bring this to AdTech, where we have a complex network of various actors, we have agencies that help websites to monetize content and publish and basically to project advertisements on their websites based on these cookies. And the reason is because you can ask more money if you know a little bit about that website visitor's behavior in the past. So it's about what and how their web journey was. For instance, to understand whether they are on the market for a new pair of shoes or not. Because if you know this from a profile, you could ask more money to the shoe sellers, because you say, hey, we recognize based on previous behavior that this website visitor is looking for shoes. And then the different shoe brands can compete with each other and say, okay, I would really love to sell my shoes to this website visitor. And that's where you need the cookie, to basically merge all these demand and supply elements together. And this is happening in an instance in a system called real-time bidding. And it's similar to how stocks are traded. So to bring this back to your question, it's a matter of understanding how the data flows work in order to be able to answer the question: am I allowed to basically do whatever I want to do with this cookie or not? And we're restricted by two laws. One is a law that restricts cookies, placing them into my browser or reading information from my computer. And the other one is restricted by more generic privacy rights. And this means sometimes you have to be nice and ask for consent or permission to use information you have for online advertising or not. So it's a very complex development in terms of how judges would look at these cases. But it's also clear that in order for them to know whether you breached the privacy law or the cookie law, to understand whether the cookie is personal data for you or not. If it's personal data, the privacy law is the main legal instrument they use, the lens through which they look and basically check, was your consent valid? And if it's not personal data, but if you're reading information from an end user's device, it doesn't really matter whether it's personal data or not. You need consent anyways. So maybe this is the beginning of an answer to your question, but it immediately unfolds into a complex legal reality.
Maybe one thing I would like to add to the SRB case you mentioned, because I think one important element, at least for me, is that was not only about one is the personal data, but also was the case was about pseudonymized data. So not really sharing the, let's say in your example, the cookie as it is. So some sort of, let's call it mask number with another entity. So, and I think this was what the case was about. So, and I think the judges ruled that it's not to be considered personal data. If I'm the one sharing it, for me it's personal data. But then if I give you, let's say, a mask version, in very simple terms, to you, for you it's not personal data if there are no really realistic expectations that you have the options or the opportunities to demask this number and get back to the real number. I think this is a very important distinction. I think that we should make, and also goes back to what we discussed earlier about privacy enhancing technologies, not only sharing raw data, but in this case pseudonymized data, that this might be a way forward, for how we can share data also responsible.
Yeah, to clarify, in this specific case, the SRB case, comments were shared linked to a pseudonymous identifier. And the question, this is not related to cookies. And the question was, is in the hands of Deloitte in this case, are these comments, do they contain enough information to know who gave those comments? And there you would need additional information that the bank has, but the receiver didn't have. And the judge made a clear distinction between those two and said, okay, in the hands of the SRB, it's personal data, but in the hands of the Deloitte, it wasn't personal data. So pseudonymization, and I agree with Sebastian, is an important privacy-enhanced technology because you reduce the ability to identify natural persons. The key question, though, is, and this is where the European data protection authorities that are assembled in a group called the European Data Protection Board, they provide guidance and clarifications about when pseudonymous data is considered to be personal data and protected by law, and when it's no longer personal data. And I think this is why we are at the moment at a crucial moment in time to see where this ruling leads to a potential redefinition of what personal data is, or clear use cases and examples provided by regulators, the data protection authorities, in which cases pseudonymization is good enough, such that it's outside of the scope of the legal protections, or whether it's still personal data, where you need a lot of accountability measures in order to process those within the limits of the law.
Yeah. This is exactly what we're currently seeing in Brussels. This is basically the summary of the discussion that we're currently having on the digital omnibus. Within the digital omnibus, we're currently looking at making the digital acquis, as you would say, so the digital legislative framework, more fitting and better for companies, and basically to improve competitiveness and improve harmonization across legislations and to reduce administrative burdens for companies. That's the initial goal of the digital omnibus. And there are a couple of provisions in there that go in a good direction. There are also a couple of provisions in there that are a little bit more challenging. But the core question, whether or not, or what actually is personal data, is one of those discussions that's still ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a couple of, or we have a proposal on the table, and we have a lot of discussion around it at the moment, in which direction it's going to go. So I'm also very interested to see where it's going to go. But this is basically the core question that we're currently discussing in a legislative framework.
Could you recap what your proposal is on what is personal data and what are different opinions on that?
The different opinions, I think, have just been outlined. So the main question really is, as of which point is something personal data? And the whole question is pseudonymized data personal data, and as of which instance, basically, does it become pseudonymized and therefore anonymized? So when do I no longer need to see this as personal data? I mean, in general, as I said, the discussion is still ongoing. For us, as an association, we try to position ourselves in a way where we say, well, what actually would make it more implementable, or what would actually help companies implement the GDPR in a way that would actually be more helpful in practice. And our position is that we say we need to focus more on a risk-based approach, which basically is enshrined in the GDPR, but it is currently not fully enshrined within the entire legislative framework. So if you can read the pseudonymized data, then it would be a personal data. But if you can't, then you need to see this as anonymized data, and therefore it is less risky. It is only risky if you can identify this person has a certain preference, if you will.
So as an industry, together with the regulators, we need to agree to where to cross that line. And that line is at which point can you connect different data sources, different data points, where this anonymous data is no longer anonymous, which sounds very theoretically. Would we want to seek to a full revamped ecosystem where there is zero data going back and forth, and only if we specifically build upon it? And is that actually possible in our ecosystem?
I think it's the reasonableness, which is in this case the main point. How likely or how reasonable is it that the information can actually be extrapolated? Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, the whole point about law, and which is why I also think legislation and law is fascinating, because what actually means reasonable? And this is the whole point. What is reasonable? Like, with how much or how easy is it to trace a person back? Is, of course, question number one. Question number two is, if that person is so far away, if the unique identifier, if you will, if that unique person is so far away from what I've actually collected about that profile, if that is so far away, then at what point can I no longer with certainty say that this is that unique website visitor who really wants to buy shoes?
Rob, as a whole industry, it seems like we're searching for the right answer. What can companies do themselves right now to really take the lead?
Well, I would certainly not discard the fact that agentic AI is going to have a huge impact on the online advertising ecosystem. And to bring a engineering perspective to the table, I would say start auditing your training data practices against this new legitimate interest that the Commission is proposing for AI training. But it would be good to take certain precautions to heart. And I'll name three. The first one is data minimization at source selection. So when you start building your models and embedding them into your AI systems, and then autonomously deploy those agents. The second one are transparency obligations. You need to be able to explain what's happening. If you're building black box, you should worry a little bit about, am I still in control in terms of what's happening here? And the third one is to build with an unconditional right to object in mind. And most companies that I have engaged with have not operationalized any of these three at all. So this would be my suggestion, to at least start with these three foundational principles when you start redesigning your data flows for a privacy-friendly future of online advertising.
Well, enough to work on. And I think you all play a great role in that. So we'll watch what happens in the coming years. And I'm sure that next year we have enough to discuss again. Dat was hem dan, deze Via Live podcast vanuit DPG Media in Amsterdam. Ik wil graag DPG Media bedanken voor het hosten van deze podcast en onze gasten. Ik hoop dat je een hoop nieuwe inzichten hebt gekregen. En wil je meer weten van ons, volg dan dit kanaal. En check natuurlijk ook eventjes via Nederland.nl. Doei!